be seated. Good morning. Everyone have a nice weekend. Mr. Blair, defendant's next witness.
Your Honor, at this time the defense will call Michael O'Hara to the stand.
Morning, sir. Raise your right hand. Do you promise the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Have a seat.
Thank you.
I'm going to pull that microphone down towards you a little bit. Would you please state your name for the record, spelling your last name?
Yes, it's Michael W. O'Hara, O' capital H-A-R-A.
And where are you currently employed?
I am employed by the University of Iowa in Iowa City.
What do you do there?
I'm a professor of psychological and brain sciences, and I'm a member of the clinical psychology faculty.
Well, tell me a little bit about your education.
Okay, I have a Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I received my Ph.D. in 1980, and I have been teaching at the University of Iowa since that time.
Is that all the schools that you attended?
No, I attended Regis College in Denver. I had, after that I was in the Navy, and I attended Del Mar Community College in Corpus Christi while I was in the Navy. I attended Texas A&I University in Kingsville, Texas while I was in the Navy, and then I finished up at the University of Memphis in 1974 with my undergraduate degree.
And what are your duties? What do you do at the University of Iowa?
Well, as a professor, as a faculty member, I teach undergraduate and graduate students, mostly in topics on clinical psychology. I supervise graduate students in their research. I do quite a bit of service for the university and nationally. And then I just do a lot of my own research. I focus specifically on what's called perinatal mental health, or problems, emotional problems that women may have during pregnancy and in the postpartum period.
Now, is that a specialization of yours?
Yes, it's an area that I've been working in since 1979. So from the time I did my dissertation at the University of Pittsburgh through to the present, I've been pretty much completely focused on what we call perinatal mental health.
All right. Now, I think you also said that you have some oversight duties with regards to the clinic.
Right. So one of my responsibilities is to supervise our clinical psychology graduate students. We have a training clinic in our building. It's called the Seashore Psychology Clinic, named after Carl Seashore, who was an important figure at the university. And so our students see psychotherapy patients, do assessments in that clinic, and I'm one of the clinic supervisors. So I observe therapy sessions, I work with the students to improve their therapy skills, and generally provide oversight for the students that I'm supervising in any one semester.
Do you see patients yourself?
I do not.
And why is that?
Well, because of the press of my responsibilities to do my teaching, my research, supervise graduate students, I just don't have time to see patients in addition to all of that.
Can you talk a little bit about your research? Who have you done research for, on what subject?
The research that I've done over the years, when I began this program of research in the late 70s, there was very little going on in the United States, a little bit more in the United Kingdom, but very little in the United States on risks that women had for psychological problems during pregnancy and the postpartum period. We knew very little about treating women during that period of time. So in my early work, I focused mostly on studies where we would follow women through pregnancy and the postpartum, trying to understand changes in their functioning and whether they became depressed or not or had significant symptoms of anxiety. Over time, my team began to get into doing psychotherapy outcome research, so we were one of the first groups in the U.S. to do controlled trials of a variety of different psychotherapies, particularly what we call interpersonal psychotherapy, and that work continues today. I do work that's funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, the Veterans Administration, the Health Resources and Services Administration, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. In the state of Iowa, we work a lot with the Iowa Department of Public Health to assist them in providing services to women in the clinics across the state.
Now, you talked about depression in the postpartum period. Is there a layman's term for that?
The layperson's term for that would be just postpartum depression. There's no clinical diagnosis of postpartum depression in what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, but they do have what is called an onset specifier called peripartum onset. So a woman who has an episode of depression or some other serious mental illness that begins during pregnancy or within the first 4 weeks after delivery would receive what we call this peripartum onset specifier. Now, having said that, the field more generally and the lay public tend to see postpartum depression as an entity that can occur or continue through the first year postpartum. So most of the research that goes on does not necessarily only focus on depressions that begin in the first 4 weeks, but rather depressions that are prevalent during the first year.
Commissioner Bush, you may. I'm handing you a document marked Defendant's Exhibit A. Please tell me what that is.
That's my curriculum vitae.
And is that a more detailed listing of all of your credentials, education, things of that nature?
It is.
Your Honor, I'm going to offer Defendant's Exhibit A. The objection? Raising. That back on me. Now, what will you have to do in this case?
So I was asked to examine information provided to me through depositions and interviews and make some judgments about the mental status of Cheyenne Harris, particularly as they might bear on depression.
Were you able to personally examine Cheyenne Harris?
No, I was not.
Would it have been nice if you could have done so?
It would have been desirable if I could have examined Ms. Harris directly, yes.
Is it somewhat difficult and unusual to do this kind of examination without examining the subject herself?
Yes, it's not ideal in any way. We would typically want to directly examine an individual who we believe might have a mental illness.
If I understand correctly, then what you did was you looked at the documentation, the interviews, those kind of things?
Yes, that's correct.
Particularly, what materials did you review?
If it's permissible, I'd just like to refer to my notes, but There were reports from Child Protective Services that I reviewed. There was the interview with Ms. Harris by Chris Calloway. There was a deposition of Jennifer Schreiber, a deposition of Brandy Harris, who is Cheyenne's mother, a deposition of Jordan Clark, who was a friend of the couple, Chief Deputy Reed Palo's body camera footage I reviewed, the statement of Chief Deputy Palo, an interview with Zachary Koehn, and then a variety of pictures and other exhibits.
Did you have access to Sterling's medical records?
Yes.
That would have included the records from his birth and also the autopsy records.
That's correct.
Did you have a deposition from Isabel Snyder?
Isabel Snyder?
Another neighbor.
I don't recall reading that deposition.
Okay. All right. In trying to figure this out, let me ask you this. What causes depression in the postpartum period?
So, this is something that we, as a field, been working on for a very, very long time. Women who are in the postpartum or are pregnant are also young women, and we know that being young is a risk factor unto itself, and women have a rate of depression of approximately twice that of men. So young women, whether they're pregnant, whether they're postpartum or not, are susceptible to becoming depressed. So with respect to postpartum depression, there are a number of what we would call risk factors, things that increase the likelihood. So youth would certainly be one. Women who are of low socioeconomic status, that is, they're poor, have less access to resources. We know from the literature that women who have unstable housing, that is, they move a lot, particularly around the time of having the child, they would be at increased risk. Stressful life events that they might be experiencing, increased risk. Previous trauma, such as abuse of one sort or another, increases risk. So these are all factors that would increase the risk. With respect to the specific cause, there's no way to know in particular. There is some evidence that hormonal changes during pregnancy and postpartum increase risk or could lead to depression. But many of these depressions develop because of the social circumstances of women. Traumatic childbirth can be another cause. And finally, women who have high levels of anxiety, often that's a precursor to becoming depressed.
In talking about those risk factors, and I'm going to talk in more detail about that. You mentioned young age being that was the first risk factor you mentioned. Does it matter whether or not the woman in particular had her first child at a young age?
Well, another risk factor that I didn't mention is having several children. So the fact that a woman would have her first child at a young age, and then at a very young age, and then have a second child, increases her burden, and so that would matter. But if there was a lot of spacing, it probably wouldn't matter so much.
So is it fair to say that 2 children at the age of 2 would be a higher risk factor than just having 1 child?
That's right.
You said, I think you also mentioned low socioeconomic status. What about financial difficulties? Does that play into it?
Well, the role of low SES or financial difficulties is sort of multifaceted. In one respect, if you have few financial resources, it makes it more difficult to get to manage your budget, to get things for the baby, to have stable housing. These are all things that essentially create stress that can be a contributing factor to depression.
Now, as far as young age, did you see that in this case?
Yes. Ms. Harris was 18 when she had her first child and 20 when her son Sterling was born. So she would certainly be considered to be of young age in the context of the research that I know.
What about low socioeconomic status?
Well, the record seems very clear from the interviews and the depositions that this family was constantly struggling around financial issues. So yes.
What about multiple children under the age of 15?
Yes, that was present as well.
Did you observe, well, what did you see with regards to their housing and frequent moving?
Well, from the depositions and the interviews, it appeared that they frequently moved. Housing, in some cases, was quite inadequate from what I could tell. So stable housing was a major, or the lack of stable housing would be a major contributor here.
What about conflictual relationship with partner and potentially infidelity?
Yeah, I didn't mention that earlier, but that would also, certainly the relationship with the partner is something we focus on quite a bit. The record of depositions and interviews that I reviewed suggested that this couple had quite a bit of difficulty, both in their personal relationship over time as well as in relationships with the family members.
What about poor social support system?
Poor social support is, or let's say good social support can often mitigate the effects of stressors. I would say, based on my review, that it was variable. Sometimes they had good, but often it was not very strong from family and friends. And from the record, it would appear to me that Cheyenne would withdraw from opportunities for social support. So generally, I would say it was pretty inadequate.
Would that be supported by things like Brady Harris's testimony that she didn't actually have much of any communication with Cheyenne for the last, say, 3 weeks to a month of Sterling's life?
Yes, because it seemed like the mother was more involved before that.
Just going through other risk factors. What about substance abuse?
Substance abuse is often accompanies depression. The record indicates that I read anyway that she used methamphetamine from time to time. It was slightly unclear to me how frequently, but that would be, whether that's a risk factor or an accompanying factor is a little bit difficult to tell, but it certainly often substances like that will make depressions worse.
What about traumatic birth?
Yes, and the birth of Sterling was very traumatic. It ended okay, but certainly having the baby come at home without a midwife or someone skilled in this would be fairly traumatic. The other thing, probably more important, is that she lost a lot of blood. She hemorrhaged and had to get transfusions, and typically these days hospitals do not do transfusions unless they're absolutely necessary. So she would definitely been high on a scale of having a traumatic birth.
Would it have been a contributing factor that she wasn't able to attend the initial medical visit for Sterling? after birth? I think the testimony was that Brandy Harris actually took steroids without knowing.
Well, I think that's difficult to say.
I think there is some evidence, at least early on, that there were difficulties feeding the baby. Does that play into it?
Baby's ill health, the traumatic birth, they all are of a piece, and putting that all together, it was a additional care because of evidently water in its lungs and a possibility of infection. I think there was a concern about meconium in the amniotic fluid, which usually requires attention from the physicians, the pediatricians. So I think it's fair to say that this birth experience was fairly traumatic for her, and it would be for any woman.
Earlier you mentioned prior traumatic events. Is that a risk factor?
The record was clear that there was evidence of some prior trauma for Cheyenne. The record wasn't clear what the nature of that trauma, if it involved certainly sexual or physical abuse. It definitely would be a risk factor. Women who have those kinds of past experiences are much more likely to have a depressive episode, probably anxiety and possibly PTSD as well. So yes, but I don't know. The record, at least as I read it, was not clear about what that trauma would have been.
Within the record, you were able to review during the prior history of depression?
Her physician, John Kammer, and I believe he was in Cresco, had identified her as being depressed following the birth of her daughter, Nayla. He prescribed an antidepressant for her. She reported that she had had postpartum depression associated with that birth, but she also stated that she either did not take it, or I guess she took it for some period of time and then stopped taking it because she thought it was making her nauseous.
Now, given that she had depression in the postpartum period after Nala's birth, and given all these risk factors, is her likelihood of having it after Sterling's birth even higher?
Yes. So another risk factor for postpartum depression is having had a previous postpartum depression or a previous depression. So yes, that's true.
Now, did you review a copy of the interview of Zachary Koehn by Chris Calloway?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, John Turner. My bad.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Is Mr. Koehn said in that interview that he had been present at a meeting with Dr. Kammer after Sterling's birth, and they had discussed baby blues and a potential prescription for Lexapro? Would that be consistent with Cheyenne having been diagnosed with depression by Dr. Kammer after Sterling's birth?
Yes. So Lexapro is an antidepressant. It would not be an uncommon one to prescribe for a woman experiencing postpartum depression. He had identified depression following Nala's birth, so he obviously thought that she needed antidepressant medication following Sterling's birth as well.
Anything else significant in Cheyenne's mental health history that you're aware of?
I believe it was her mother who reported that she did have a history of cutting, which is often associated with emotional instability, which is also associated with depression. So that did stand out when she was a teenager.
Now, in reviewing those materials, were you able to find any evidence that Cheyenne Harris actually had depression?
So the materials were somewhat limited, but there was evidence from Jennifer Shriver's deposition that in some weeks before, I'm not really sure, in the summer, she had observed Cheyenne outside. She seemed to have what we sometimes call very flat affect, or not very kind of experiencing any pleasure at all. She had her daughter with her, but when asked about her son, she had evidently sort of forgot that the son was still, Sterling was still in the house. She didn't seem to be she wasn't really showing very good judgment or decision making at that time. So these were some of the symptoms. Also, when I re-reviewed her interview with Chris Calloway, she also seemed to have very little, her memory wasn't very good about dates and things that he was asking her about. And this is very consistent with being depressed, is that you just have a hard time kind of organizing things and making decisions and remembering. So she showed sad affect. She seemed to be, it was very flat a lot of the time. She had difficulty in thinking, concentrating. Those were the things that stood out to me.
So if Jennifer Shriver got up there in that witness box where you're sitting and told us that at one point she was talking to Cheyenne. Cheyenne couldn't even remember how old Sterling was. Would that be consistent?
Yes, it would be. You would. Most mothers know how old their child is, so that it's pretty striking.
Especially when the child is under 4 months.
Right.
Now, I know you didn't review it, but if Isabel Snyder, another neighbor, got up there and testified consistent with Ms. Shriver, would that also be consistent?
Yes, it would be.
I think you talked about a lack of pleasure.
Yes.
Where's that come from?
Well, what I mean by that, so one of the core symptoms of depression is what is technically called anhedonia, or lack of ability to experience pleasure or joy. Sometimes we see this so, for example, if someone is not participating in any social interactions, they're withdrawn, and they don't look forward to things, we often would characterize that as a loss of ability to experience pleasure. And it did seem like she was experiencing that. I would have needed to really interview her directly to ascertain that, but that was my sense.
You talked a little bit about some of the symptoms of depression. What are the symptoms of depression? What would this have looked like for somebody who was on the inside? What would they have seen? Or what would a clinical observer see when reviewing somebody who has depression like this?
Yeah. So there are several key symptoms. A person who would receive a clinical diagnosis of depression would either have to have a distinct characteristic of being sad or down or low mood that has some persistence, or this experience of loss of pleasure in usual things that are usually pleasurable. Those would be, one of the two has to be there. And then The other core symptoms of depression include excessive guilt or self-blame, problems in sleeping, either sleeping too much or too little, appetite disturbances, eating too much, losing weight, difficulties in concentration, thinking, making decisions, problems, what we call motor problems, are basically being very slowed down, moving slowly, talking slowly, and then suicidal ideation or attempts at self-harm would be the core symptoms of depression. And we would want to see at least 5 of those in total out of 9, and that they persist and interfere with functioning before we would make a diagnosis.
How would something like this affect Cheyenne's ability to care for Sterling?
Well, an individual who is depressed, and we've done quite a bit of work with depressed mothers, we find that their ability to parent appropriately is diminished. So it would not be surprising if a depressed mother would not be showing the usual level of care that she would if she were not depressed. And these characteristics can last over many weeks or months, depending on the severity of the depression. So it's, in some cases, we would see that a child would be cared for by other family members if the depression were severe enough.
Now, there's some evidence in this case that at least until the beginning of August, Sterling was all right. And then there's some kind of downturn sometime in the month of August. Is that inconsistent with depression in the postpartum period?
Well, depressions in the postpartum can begin at any time. They can have a course that moves from mild to severe over a period of time. So the fact that it was a couple of months, that things got bad a few months after the baby was born, is certainly not inconsistent with our understanding of postpartum depression.
Could other things have been propping her up during that period that Sterling was doing okay and then those things?
Well, if she was getting help from her mother, if she was getting help from Mr. Koehn, if she was getting help from her neighbors, this is often what happens when we see a woman who's having depression, as others kind of rally around and support her. If that would change, then that could be problematic for sure.
Now, throughout all of this, Nala is fine, or mostly fine. Is that inconsistent?
It's not inconsistent. Honestly, it's a little surprising, but it's not inconsistent. It would seem that Sterling was separated from Nala so that they wouldn't disturb each other. So Nala was as a 2-year-old, she was much more of a presence and could, in a sense, speak for herself.
Basically force attention to be played.
The interview that Cheyenne Harris had with Chris Calloway suggested as much, that Nala was very demanding of Cheyenne and Zachary as well. Yes.
Is that one of the reasons why multiple children are a heightened risk factor?
Well, in our research we found that when a woman is having her first child, even though she may be an inexperienced mother, there are opportunities to get rest and recuperate while the baby is sleeping, for example, assuming that the mother can stay home. With the second child, particularly a toddler, those opportunities are really diminished, so that often women are just exhausted from childcare, from whatever housework that they have to do, because they can't really sleep when the baby's sleeping because the toddler is up. And we find that women with 2 or more children are much more likely to be having social adjustment problems than women with only 1 child.
Now, is it possible that Cheyenne was at least enough self-aware of this situation that she was somehow masking the symptoms?
It's possible, but it would be very difficult for me to say.
Now, all right. Next part. How does Zach's Mennonite upbringing, strict gender roles, and his limited formal education, how does that play into all of that?
Well, certainly with respect to strict gender roles, women are expected to take on child care responsibilities. Reading the record, the interviews from both Zachary and Cheyenne suggested that he left the care and feeding of the children, of the baby anyway, to Cheyenne. So he didn't seem to be, even though he seemed to be knowledgeable based on the record, he didn't seem to be engaged in taking care of Sterling in any way, and Nala when she was a baby.
All right. Somebody living with someone who's experiencing this depression and postpartum period, how apparent would it be that she was suffering in crisis?
Well, if there was a large change in her behavior, a very definitive change over some reasonable period of time, that should be very, very noticeable. If she were to talk about it and describe her internal states, that would be fairly apparent. But in my experience, if a woman is engaged in some activity that she needs to do, that sometimes it's very difficult to recognize her internal state. Many spouses are quite surprised when they hear their partner, their wife, say, "I feel terrible," and explain in great detail all you would tend to see would be activity, not so much the internal state. So it's not that hard to disguise it until it gets very severe. Then it's the woman would be staying in bed all the time and finding it very difficult to function.
But if the partner weren't around that often, still might not notice.
Yes, I mean, you've got to be around to understand what's going on with your partner. If you're not, or if you're around just very briefly, then it's going to be much more difficult.
Now, is there anything about major depression postpartum period that would affect or impede Zach's ability to provide care and And I guess what I'm asking is there anything about Cheyenne's suffering, anything here that you've seen that would prevent Zach from stepping in?
Well, I'm not sure anything would prevent him from stepping in. What I would say is that if she's not asking for help, then it might not be evident that she needs help.
Does Zach's lack of formal education play into that? For example, does it play into his ability to recognize the signs?
Yes, I mean, there was no evidence, for example, that they went to childbirth preparation classes, for example, and that would be a common context in which couples would learn about postpartum depression, for example, and what to be on the lookout for. It's very common now that we do a lot of preparation during pregnancy with women and their partners to recognize the signs, and often there's screening in hospitals following birth, and it seems like none of that happened. So it's not unreasonable to think that he would not have been really prepared to understand what was going on, even if he saw it.
Did you observe any factors that might have interfered with Zach's ability to assume a primary risk of care role?
Well, principally his absence from the home. From what I can tell for his work, that would be the major thing, and the fact that he seemed to not be able to want to encounter a dirty diaper or do feeding of a baby.
How about the fact that when he was present, most of the time at least, he was sleeping?
Right. I mean, that, in a sense, that's not being present. When he was there, he was sleeping, and then he would go to work. And from what I could tell, he was around for maybe a few hours a day to be present with the family.
Now, are you able to give any opinion as to whether or not Cheyenne Harris, in fact, suffered from major depression?
It's a difficult question because I didn't examine her, and I was not able, I had no access to any information about her from any examination. I would say given the fact that she had a recognized depression after the birth of her first child, that she was prescribed antidepressant medication after the birth of Sterling, the fact that she had numerous risk factors for depression, which would just generally increase the likelihood, and along with some clear evidence of some symptoms of depression, I would say I'm pretty confident that she had either a major depression or a variant of depression. She may have also had anxiety symptoms associated with PTSD. So I would say I'm pretty confident that she was depressed, but I would have to, again, caution that I did not examine her directly.
What is PTSD?
Post-traumatic stress disorder. And I bring that up only because of her past history of trauma, the cutting, some of her symptoms that she exhibited with that were observed, such as sort of this disengagement. You will see this sometimes with PTSD. They often go together, depression and PTSD. Some think that PTSD is, a major risk factor for depression. We see this a lot in veterans, for example, the high rates of suicide associated with depression and PTSD. So these things go together, and it seemed like that might also be a potential factor here.
Finally, Doctor, this is kind of a general question. Is it safe to say, or fair to say, I think it's fair to say it's the right term, is it fair to say that everybody deals with stressful events differently?
It's a general comment. Yes. I mean, there's a variety of ways that people can deal with stressful events. We talk about, there's a whole literature called coping, the coping literature, where some people try to ignore the stressful events, other people try to solve the problem, other people get help and support, learn new things. So people vary dramatically in how they deal with stressful events in their life.
You didn't prepare a report in this case, did you?
I did not.
You made some notes for yourself, correct?
I did.
But you didn't make a report to give to the parties?
That's correct.
And it's standard practice in your profession, if you're going to provide an opinion like this, that you would make a report, correct?
I don't know that that's the case. I was not asked to prepare a report, so I didn't prepare a report.
And you weren't asked by who?
The two public defenders here.
So the attorneys asked you to not prepare a report?
They did not ask me to prepare a report, would be, I think, fair to say.
You don't see any of your own patients, correct?
That's right.
And you've never had a forensic practice?
That's correct.
In fact, it's been over 20 years since you've done a forensic evaluation in this type of situation, correct?
That's correct.
And you agree that this type of work, what you're doing today, is typically done by a psychiatrist, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, your evaluation didn't include meeting or speaking with Cheyenne Harris.
That's correct.
It basically included reading the DCI report.
That's correct.
Now, had you met with Cheyenne Harris, that would have allowed you to make a complete evaluation, correct?
Correct.
Basically, the opinions that you provided today are your best guess as to what was going on with Cheyenne Harris at the time.
I would say my best professional judgment, yes.
You stated that Cheyenne's doctor, after Sterling's death, obviously thought she needed antidepressants. Why do you say that?
Well, my understanding is that she was prescribed an antidepressant.
After Nala's birth?
After Nala's birth, but it was also my understanding that at some point after Sterling's birth as well.
Because Zachary Koehn said so.
Yes, yes,
There's
yes.
nothing in the medical records to support that, correct?
I cannot disagree with that.
Okay, so your statement that she obviously needed them was based solely on what the defendant said.
Yes.
You said it's possible she could have masked the symptoms, but you seem to hesitate on that. If someone's in such a deep depression that they're not feeding their child, caring for their child, doing anything for their child, that's going to be pretty obvious to people, correct?
It should be pretty obvious.
Now, you also said it was unusual that she was caring for Nala, but not caring for Sterling.
I said that we would expect problems with both children, and my comment was that Nala, being a 2-year-old, was old enough to start making demands on her mother, and Nala was much more in the presence of Cheyenne than Sterling, but yes.
The baby screaming isn't demanding?
A baby screaming is very demanding.
You had your deposition taken, correct?
Yes.
And in that deposition, you stated that your conclusion from your review of the records is that there was a pretty good chance that Cheyenne was depressed during this particular time. Is that right?
Yes.
And you don't hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
And you agree it's unusual to provide this type of diagnosis
Yes.
for someone, correct?
Correct.
And you've never done that before?
Not in a setting like this.
Now, you talked about some depression symptoms, difficulties in concentrating, disturbed sleep, sad or low mood. Those can also be the same symptoms of drug use, correct?
Certainly acute drug use.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, in a state where the individual is actually intoxicated.
You also talked about these risk factors for postpartum depression. Youth, low socioeconomic status, stressful life events. Those can also be risk factors for drug use too, correct?
That is correct.
Now, you provided some opinions today regarding the defendant's culpability in all of this. Were you aware you were going to do that today?
I'm not really sure I understand your question.
Well, you were asked a lot of questions about, well, if Zach has an 8th grade education, could he be expected to know this and that? Were you aware you were going to talk about that today?
No,
That was just asked of you today, correct?
that is correct.
Because when we had your deposition, you had no idea you would be speaking about anything involving the defendant, correct?
That's correct.
And prior to coming to trial, did the defense attorneys even tell you they were going to bring up those questions?
No.
You said that it was clear from the record the defendant wasn't engaged in caring for his children when they were infants, correct?
To be precise, he wasn't, from what I read, he wasn't involved in feeding or diaper changes when the children were babies.
Because that was Cheyenne's job.
That was my understanding, yes.
And because diapers smelled and he didn't like that.
Yes.
All of those things were a choice on his part, correct?
Yes.
Does his upbringing have any excuse for choosing not to feed, bathe, change your child's diapers?
So as a private opinion, no, but it's not really germane to my area of expertise, so that would be more of a lay view.
And definitely someone's upbringing, regardless of how they were brought up, doesn't excuse or make someone not responsible for their actions, correct?
Well, again, you're asking me about my lay views on this. I would say that would be my lay view, but it's not a professional judgment.
And you yourself never met with the defendant, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, you were never asked to do an evaluation of him,
That is correct.
and you never personally spoke with him.
That is correct.
That's all I have.
Redirect.
You don't actually have Cheyenne Barrett's medical records, do you?
I may have seen something from Mercy Hospital following Sterling, but if you mean her personal medical record, no.
In other words, you would have the records from Sterling's treatment. You would have Sterling's medical records.
Right.
To the extent that notes regarding Cheyenne may be there, you would have that. You don't actually have Cheyenne's medical records.
That is correct. I do not.
And that's due to competency. patient confidentiality.
Yes.
Now, a couple of other questions. Drug use is, I think when you talked about PTSD, you said it's comorbid with depression.
That's correct.
Is drug use also comorbid with depression?
Yes, it is.
And what does it mean for something to be comorbid?
Well, it's just a technical term that means they often go together, and sometimes they share common risk factors. But generally, it just means that we see, when we see one particular disorder like depression, we're more likely to see other disorders like PTSD or substance use, or if we see substance use, we're more likely to see depression than in the general population. So it just means they tend to go together.
And I think you testified early on in your direct examination that substance use is actually a risk factor for depression.
That's right.
Now, in referencing all those risk factors, those risk factors, they're, I want to say this, they're universal. They're not specific to China Harris.
That's right.
The fact that we see all of them present in this case, that's what's significant.
That's right. So many of them together.
Nothing further.
Anything else?
No.
This witness be excused. Further evidence from the defendant.
Your Honor, the defendant rests.
Any rebuttal evidence for the state?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we have completed the evidence. I need to meet briefly with the attorneys, finalize our jury instructions. They are prepared, and I've gone through them informally with the attorneys. I need to make a formal record. So give us about a half an hour, and we should be ready to do closing arguments. So we will recess and go around and come get you.